The scent of pine blood mixed with morning frost hit Samuel Bridger's nostrils before the first rays of sunlight cracked the horizon, and he knew without checking that something precious had stepped into his trapline during the darkest hours of night. His massive hands worked quickly in the pre-dawn darkness of the Montana Territory, setting steel jaws along the creek where beaver had been building their dam for the past 3 weeks. This was 1876, and the mountains held both fortune and death in equal measure for men brave enough or foolish enough to claim them. Samuel was neither brave nor foolish. He was simply a man who understood that survival meant rising before the world woke and working until his bones ached. His broad shoulders strained against his buckskin shirt as he bent to secure another trap, his long, dark hair falling across his face, touched with morning dew that would freeze solid within the hour. He had 16 traps to set before the sun fully rose, scattered across 5 miles of Montana wilderness that he had claimed as his own through blood, sweat, and 3 harsh winters that had killed lesser men. His cabin sat in a valley protected by 2 ridges, close enough to the settlement of Bannock that he could reach civilization when necessary, far enough that the noise and chaos of gold-hungry prospectors never disturbed his peace. Samuel had come west after the war, after watching his Georgia home burn and his family scatter to the winds. The mountains asked nothing of his past and offered everything for his future, provided he was willing to work harder than any man should have to work. The last trap clicked into place just as orange light spilled across the eastern peaks. Samuel straightened, his back cracking, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He was 28 years old, stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn boots, and possessed the kind of raw physical strength that came from hauling water, splitting wood, and wrestling animals that weighed as much as he did. His face bore a thick beard that protected against the cold, and his blue eyes had the sharp clarity of a man who spent his days reading animal tracks and weather patterns instead of books. He would not check these traps until late afternoon, after he had tended to his horse, repaired the section of fence damaged by a black bear the previous week, and hauled enough firewood to last through the coming storm he could smell building in the north. This was his rhythm, the pattern he had perfected over years of solitary living. Set before dawn, check late, return to the cabin before full dark. But everything about that rhythm shattered 3 weeks ago when he found her stumbling through the snow half a mile from his door. Samuel started the long walk back toward his cabin, his mind already racing ahead to the moment when he would push through that heavy wooden door and see her face light up with relief that he had returned safely once more. Caroline Fletcher had appeared in his life like an answered prayer he had been too afraid to speak aloud. She had been traveling with her brother's family from St. Louis to the goldfields, and their wagon had overturned in a narrow pass during an early autumn snowstorm. Her brother Thomas had been killed instantly when the wagon rolled. His wife Margaret had died from her injuries 2 days later, leaving Caroline alone with 2 young nephews in country that showed no mercy to the unprepared. Samuel had been checking his trapline when he heard a child crying. He found Caroline first, her dress torn and blood-stained, her face pale with cold and shock, trying to carry both boys through snow that came up to her thighs. She had looked at him with eyes the color of warm honey, and something in his chest had shifted permanently out of place. He had gathered all 3 of them without a word, carrying the boys on his back and supporting Caroline with one arm as he led them to safety. That first night she had barely spoken, too exhausted and grief-stricken to do more than hold the children close and stare into his fire. Samuel had given them his bed and slept on the floor near the hearth, his rifle across his lap in case whatever had spooked their horses came searching. The boys, 6-year-old James and 4-year-old William, had cried themselves to sleep. Carolyn had sat awake until nearly dawn, and Samuel had pretended not to notice the tears streaming silently down her face. In the morning, she had finally spoken. Her voice was soft but steady, the kind of voice that suggested strength underneath the grief. She thanked him for his kindness and asked if he knew the way to Bannock. She had an aunt there, or at least her brother had believed there was an aunt there, though Caroline admitted she had never met the woman and possessed only a name and the vague hope that family might exist in this wild place. Samuel had nodded and told her he would take her to town once the weather cleared. The storm had raged for 3 more days, trapping all of them inside the cabin. During those days, something remarkable happened. Carolyn did not sit idle in her grief. She could not with two small boys depending on her. She organized Samuel's chaotic food stores, mended tears in his clothes that he had been ignoring for months, and cooked meals that actually tasted like someone cared whether they were eaten. The boys slowly emerged from their shock, tentatively exploring the cabin and asking Samuel endless questions about the animal pelts hanging on his walls, the massive elk antlers above his door, the workings of his traps and guns. Samuel found himself talking more in those 3 days than he had in the previous 3 years. Caroline listened with genuine interest as he explained how to read track patterns, which plants were safe to eat, how to predict weather by watching animal behavior. She was 23 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, educated at a ladies' seminary before her father's death had forced her to live with her brother's family. She had been excited about the adventure of going west, right up until that adventure had taken everything from her. When the storm finally broke, Samuel had saddled his horse and prepared to guide them to Bannock. But Caroline had stood in his doorway, her hand resting on the rough wood frame, and asked a question that changed everything. "Do you need help here?" she had said quietly. "I know you live alone, and I can see that this is hard work for one person. The boys and I have nowhere else to go immediately, and I thought perhaps we could stay a while longer. I could cook and clean properly and help you with whatever you need, in exchange for shelter until I can locate my aunt and make proper arrangements." Samuel had looked at her standing there in a dress he had scrubbed the blood from while she slept, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid, her eyes meeting his directly without fear or shame, and he had known even then that he would never want her to leave. But he had simply nodded and said that sounded like a fair arrangement, and she had smiled for the first time since he found her. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, Samuel's entire existence revolved around the hours between leaving at dawn and returning at dusk. He pushed himself harder during the day so he could return earlier. He organized his trap lines more efficiently. He took risks he normally would not take, like checking traps in marginal light or traveling faster than was truly safe. All because every minute away from his cabin felt like a minute stolen from something precious. The cabin came into view as he crested the final ridge. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight column, which meant Caroline had the fire built up properly. He had taught her that in the first week how to stack wood so it burned hot and clean instead of smoky and wasteful. She had learned everything he showed her with quick intelligence and no complaints about the hard work involved in surviving this kind of life. Samuel's heart rate picked up as he approached the door, and he felt almost foolish about it. He was a grown man, a veteran of war, a survivor of conditions that broke most people. Yet the thought of seeing Caroline's face when he walked through that door made him feel like a boy anticipating Christmas morning. He pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the warmth of the cabin and the smell of something savory cooking. Carolyn turned from the hearth, and her entire face transformed with a smile that made Samuel's chest tighten. "You are back," she said, and there was such relief in her voice that he wondered if she had been worried. "I was starting to watch the light and calculate when you would return." "I'm always back," Samuel said, pulling off his heavy coat and hanging it on the peg by the door. "Set the traps early enough that I can get back before dark." William came barreling across the cabin and wrapped himself around Samuel's leg with the complete trust of a child who had found safety. "Did you see any bears? James said you probably saw a bear." "No bears today," Samuel said, reaching down to ruffle the boy's hair. "But I saw elk tracks up by the north ridge. Big bull, probably 8 points." James looked up from where he was attempting to carve a piece of wood with a small knife Samuel had given him. The boy was careful and focused, good traits for surviving out here. "Will you go after him?" "Maybe in a few weeks when the season is right," Samuel said. He moved further into the cabin, drawn toward the hearth where Caroline was stirring something in the iron pot. "What are you making?" "Stew with the rabbit you brought yesterday, and some of those dried vegetables from your stores," Caroline said. She looked up at him, and he realized how close he had gotten to her, near enough to see the small freckles across her nose, near enough to smell the clean scent of the soap she used. "I hope that is acceptable. I know you have to make your supplies last through winter." "It is more than acceptable," Samuel said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Everything you cook is better than anything I ever managed on my own." Caroline's cheeks flushed pink, and she turned back to the pot. "You are kind to say so, though I suspect you have eaten a great deal of burned beans and tough venison in your time here." "More than I care to remember," Samuel admitted. He forced himself to step back, to give her space, even though every instinct in his body wanted to stay close. "I need to tend to the horse and bring in more firewood. I can smell a storm coming." "Already?" Caroline's face showed concern. "We just had one 3 days ago." "Winter is coming early this year," Samuel said. "The animals are preparing. We need to do the same." He went back outside before he could do something foolish like reach out and touch her face, like tell her that she had become more essential to his existence than food or water. He had known her for less than a month. It was too soon, too fast, too much. Yet every rational thought dissolved when she smiled at him. Samuel spent the next 2 hours working with determined focus, hauling wood until he had enough stacked to last a week, checking the horse's hooves and making sure the small shelter he had built for the animal was secure against wind. He repaired a weak spot in the cabin's wall where the chinking had cracked and reinforced the door with an extra beam. All the while, his mind kept drifting back to Caroline inside, to the way she moved around his space like she belonged there, to how the cabin had transformed from a place he slept into something that felt like a home. When he finally came back inside, full darkness had fallen. Caroline had lit the oil lamps, and their warm glow filled the cabin with soft light. The boys were eating their stew at the small table, and Caroline had set aside a bowl for Samuel. She handed it to him as he entered, their fingers brushing in the exchange, and the contact sent electricity up his arm. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You work so hard," Caroline replied, just as quietly. "It is the least I can do." They ate together, the boys chattering about their day while Samuel listened, and Caroline occasionally interjected with corrections or additions. William had apparently tried to feed a squirrel that came near the cabin window, and James had finished the spelling lesson Caroline had assigned him from the one book she had managed to save from the wagon wreck, a volume of classical poetry that seemed absurdly delicate in this rough place. After dinner, Caroline settled the boys into the bed Samuel had built for them in the corner of the cabin. She told them a story about brave knights and distant kingdoms, her voice low and soothing. Samuel cleaned the dishes and tried not to stare at the picture she made, sitting on the edge of the bed with lamplight making her hair glow like honey in sunlight. When the boys were finally asleep, Caroline rose and came to stand beside Samuel at the hearth. They were alone for the first time all day, separated from the children by the length of the cabin and the sound of crackling fire. "I have been thinking," Caroline said after a long moment of silence, "about my aunt in Bannock." Samuel's hands stilled on the cup he was drying. "Have you decided you want to go search for her?" "I sent a letter with the supply wagon that came through last week," Caroline said. "Do you remember? You helped me write out the direction." "I remember." Samuel's chest felt tight. "I received a reply today. The wagon driver brought it when he stopped to check on whether you had any pelts ready for trade." Caroline's voice was carefully neutral. "My aunt died 2 years ago. There is no family in Bannock." Samuel turned to look at her fully. "I'm sorry. I know you were hoping to find her." "I was hoping for somewhere to go," Caroline corrected quietly, "for somewhere that I belonged with the boys. But that place does not exist, at least not in Bannock." "Then we will figure something else out," Samuel said immediately. "There are other towns, other settlements, or I could build an addition to the cabin, make it bigger, more comfortable for all of you. You do not have to leave until you are ready." Caroline looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Samuel, you have been so kind to us. You saved our lives, and you have asked for nothing in return. But I cannot keep imposing on your hospitality indefinitely. You are a bachelor, living alone by choice. You should not have to support 3 extra people who appeared in your life by accident." "It does not feel like an accident," Samuel said, and then stopped, unsure how to continue without revealing too much. "It does not feel like an accident to me either," Caroline whispered. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, and even through the fabric of his shirt, he could feel the warmth of her touch. "I think perhaps this is where I was meant to end up all along. I think perhaps my brother's wagon went over that ridge so I would end up here with you." Samuel's heart was pounding so hard, he was certain she could hear it. "Caroline, I need to tell you something." "Then tell me," she said simply. "I am not a man who speaks pretty words or knows how to behave in polite company. Samuel started, the words coming out rough and unpracticed. "I have lived alone in these mountains for 5 years because I did not think I could live any other way. I lost everything in the war, and I came out here to build something new, something that was just mine. I never expected to want anything more than what I had." Caroline's hand tightened on his arm, encouraging him to continue. "Then you walked into my life, half frozen and grieving, and everything changed," Samuel said, and now that he had started, he could not seem to stop. "Every morning I set those traps in the dark, and all I can think about is getting back here to see you. I check them late so I have an excuse to stay longer, to be here for breakfast, but then I rush through everything so I can return earlier. My whole day revolves around the hours I get to spend in this cabin with you." "Samuel," Caroline breathed, and there were tears on her cheeks now. "I know it is too soon, and I know you have been through something terrible, and I know I should give you more time," Samuel continued, unable to stop now that he had begun. "But I need you to know that if you want to stay, if you want to build a life here with those boys, then I want that too, more than I have ever wanted anything. And if you do not feel the same way, then I will help you get wherever you need to go, and I will make sure you have everything you need to start over. But I had to tell you. I had to say it out loud at least once." Caroline was crying openly now, but she was also smiling. "You think I have not noticed. You think I have not seen the way you look at me when you think I am not watching. You think I do not understand why you push yourself so hard to come back earlier each day." "I tried to hide it," Samuel admitted. "You did a terrible job," Caroline said, and she laughed even as tears streamed down her face. "Samuel, I fell in love with you the first night I spent in this cabin when I watched you sleep on the floor with your rifle across your lap because you wanted to make sure we were safe. I fell in love with you when you taught William how to whistle using a blade of grass, and when you spent 3 hours helping James sound out words in that poetry book, and when you brought home a rabbit and showed me 17 different ways to cook it so the boys would not get bored with the same meal." "You love me," Samuel said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I love you," Caroline confirmed. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. "I love you, and I want to stay here. I want to build a life with you in this wild, beautiful place. I want to make this cabin into a home. I want to be here every night when you come back from checking your traps." Samuel reached out with trembling hands and cupped her face, his calloused thumbs brushing away her tears. "I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this choice." "I could never regret it," Caroline said. "This is where I belong, with you." Samuel kissed her then, slow and gentle despite the roaring in his blood that demanded he pull her closer. She tasted like hope and home, and everything good he had thought was lost forever. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, feeling the hard muscle there, and she made a small sound that nearly undid him. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said quietly. "I want to marry you properly, with a preacher and everything legal. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours." "Then we will ride to Bannock tomorrow and find a preacher," Caroline said firmly. "I do not want to wait. I have already lost too much time to grief and fear. I want to start our life together now." "Tomorrow," Samuel agreed. "But tonight I will sleep by the fire like I have been doing, and you will have the bed like always." Caroline smiled and touched his bearded cheek softly. "You are a good man, Samuel Bridger." "I'm just a man who got impossibly lucky," Samuel replied. They stayed up late talking by the fire, speaking in whispers so they would not wake the boys. Caroline told him about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about the ladies' seminary where she had learned poetry and painting and all the accomplishments that meant nothing out here in the mountains. Samuel told her about growing up on a farm in Georgia, about fighting in the war and losing everything, about the first winter in Montana when he nearly starved because he did not know what he was doing. "I cannot promise you an easy life," Samuel said as the fire burned low. "Winters here are brutal, and the work never stops. You will go days without seeing another woman. The boys will have to learn things differently than they would in a town with a proper school." "I do not want an easy life," Caroline replied. "I want a real life with a man I love in a place where we can build something meaningful. I can teach the boys what they need to know, and you can teach them the rest. We will make it work." "We will," Samuel agreed, and he meant it down to his bones. The next morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for the ride to Bannock. Samuel hitched his horse to the small cart he used for hauling supplies and helped Caroline and the boys climb into the back. He had layered blankets to keep them warm, and Caroline had packed food for the journey. It was 8 miles to town along a rough trail, but the weather held and they made good time. Bannock was a chaotic sprawl of buildings thrown up quickly by men chasing gold. The streets were muddy rivers of half-frozen slush, and the air smelled like wood smoke and unwashed bodies and desperate ambition. Samuel kept Caroline close as they navigated through crowds of prospectors and merchants and women who worked in the saloons. The boys stared wide-eyed at everything, overwhelmed by the noise and activity after weeks in the quiet mountains. The church was a small building at the edge of town, more of a room than a proper structure, but it had a cross above the door and a minister who looked sober and serious. Reverend Thomas Matthews listened to their story with kind eyes and agreed to marry them that very afternoon once the proper paperwork could be prepared. Samuel took Caroline to the general store while they waited. "Pick out whatever you need," he told her. "Fabric for new dresses, supplies for the boys, anything that will make life easier." "Samuel, you do not have to spend your money on us," Caroline protested. "You are going to be my wife," Samuel said firmly. "Everything I have is yours. Now please, let me do this." Caroline chose carefully, selecting practical items rather than luxuries. Fabric for warm clothes, boots for the boys whose feet were growing rapidly, coffee and sugar and spices to make their meals more varied. Samuel added things she did not choose, like a thick wool cloak for her, blankets of soft flannel, a book of children's stories for James and William. The storekeeper tallied everything up while Samuel counted out coins from the leather pouch where he kept his earnings from selling pelts. They were married at 3 o'clock that afternoon, with Reverend Matthews's wife and the storekeeper serving as witnesses. Samuel had no ring to offer, but the minister said words would serve just as well. Caroline wore the same mended dress she'd been wearing for weeks, but to Samuel she looked more beautiful than any woman in silk and jewels. She spoke her vows in a clear, steady voice, promising to love and honor him for all their days. Samuel's voice was rough with emotion when he made the same promises to her. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Matthews said with a smile. Samuel kissed Caroline there in the tiny church, with the boys watching and the witnesses clapping, and he knew he was the richest man in the Montana Territory. They started the journey back to the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Caroline sat beside Samuel on the cart bench now instead of in the back, and her hand rested on his thigh in a gesture of intimacy that still felt new and precious. The boys sang songs in the back, happy and full after Samuel had bought them candy at the store. "What are you thinking about?" Caroline asked as they climbed the last ridge before the valley where the cabin waited. "I am thinking that I need to check my traps soon, but I do not want to leave you," Samuel admitted. "I am thinking that my whole life has changed in less than a month, and I still cannot quite believe you are real." "I am very real," Caroline assured him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture made slightly awkward by the height difference, but no less sweet for it. "And you do not have to choose between your work and me. I understand that those traps are what keep us fed and sheltered. I will be waiting when you return, every single evening for the rest of our lives." "That is all I need," Samuel said quietly. "Just you, waiting at the end of the day." They reached the cabin as the last light was fading from the sky. Samuel helped Caroline down from the cart, and for a moment they stood together in the cold evening air, looking at the small structure that would be their home. "It is not much," Samuel said, suddenly seeing the cabin through her eyes, the rough logs and simple construction, the lack of any refinement or comfort. "It is everything," Caroline replied. She took his hand and squeezed it hard. "It is warm and safe and full of love. What more could we possibly need?" That night, after the boys were asleep and the fire had burned down to coals, Samuel and Caroline became husband and wife in truth. Samuel was careful and gentle, mindful of her inexperience and his own strength. Caroline came to him without fear, trusting him completely, and the gift of that trust humbled him more than anything else in his life. They moved together in the darkness of the cabin, learning each other's bodies, and when it was over, Caroline curled against his chest with her head tucked under his chin, and Samuel wrapped his arms around her and knew he would defend this woman with his last breath. The next morning, Samuel rose before dawn as always, moving quietly so he would not disturb Caroline's sleep. But she woke anyway, her eyes opening as he pulled on his boots. "You're leaving," she murmured sleepily. "Just to set the traps," Samuel whispered. He leaned over and kissed her forehead. "I will be back by this afternoon." "Be safe," Caroline said, and her hand caught his for a moment, holding on like she was reluctant to let him go. "Always," Samuel promised. He set the traps in record time that morning, his body moving through the familiar motions while his mind stayed back at the cabin with his wife. His wife. The word still felt strange and wonderful. He had spent so many years alone, convinced that solitude was his destiny, and now suddenly he had a family. A wife who loved him, 2 boys who looked at him like he hung the moon, a home that felt alive with warmth and laughter. Samuel checked his existing traps late in the day as the sun started its descent. He had caught 2 beavers and a marten, good pelts that would bring decent money when he took them to trade. He worked quickly, resetting the traps and skinning the animals with practiced efficiency. The whole time his mind calculated the remaining daylight, the distance back to the cabin, whether he would make it before full dark. He always made it. That was his promise to himself and to Caroline. No matter how far he ranged or how hard the work, he would always be back in time to hold her. Samuel came through the cabin door just as Caroline was setting out dinner. She turned and smiled at him, and the welcome in that smile made every hard minute of the day worthwhile. "You are home," she said, and there was such satisfaction in her voice, such rightness. "I am home," Samuel agreed. The pattern of their days settled into a rhythm as autumn deepened toward winter. Samuel rose before dawn, kissed his sleeping wife, and headed out to his trap lines in the frigid darkness. He worked hard and fast, driven by the knowledge that Caroline was waiting. He checked his traps late so he could spend more time at the cabin in the mornings, helping Caroline with heavy chores, playing with the boys, stealing moments alone with his wife before duty called him away. Every evening he returned before full dark, and every evening Caroline was there to welcome him. Sometimes she had dinner ready, filling the cabin with savory smells. Sometimes she was teaching the boys their lessons, her patient voice explaining letters and numbers. Sometimes she was simply sitting by the fire mending clothes or preparing pelts, and she would look up when he entered with a smile that made his heart race. At night, after the boys were asleep, Samuel and Caroline explored the landscape of their marriage. They made love quietly in the darkness, learning what brought each other pleasure, growing more comfortable and confident with each passing night. They talked about their dreams for the future, about building a bigger cabin, about the possibility of their own children someday, about growing old together in these mountains they both loved. "Do you ever miss Pennsylvania?" Samuel asked her one night as they lay tangled together in the narrow bed. "Sometimes I miss certain things," Caroline admitted. "I miss my mother, though she's been gone for 5 years now. I miss the feeling of safety that came from knowing exactly what each day would bring. But I do not miss the life I had there. I was decorative and useless, trained to paint watercolors and play piano and make pleasant conversation. Here I am necessary. Here I matter." "You matter more than anything," Samuel said fiercely, pulling her closer. "I know," Caroline said softly. "I see it in your eyes every time you look at me. I feel it in the way you touch me. Samuel, you have given me more in these few months than I had in my entire life before. Purpose and love and a place where I truly belong." "You have given me the same," Samuel replied. He kissed her temple, breathing in the clean scent of her hair. "I did not know I was lonely until you showed me what it felt like not to be." Winter arrived in earnest in mid-November, dumping 3 feet of snow in a single night. Samuel woke to a world transformed, everything buried in white silence. The boys were ecstatic, having never seen so much snow at once. Caroline helped them bundle into every warm piece of clothing they owned, and Samuel took them outside to show them how to walk in snowshoes, how to recognize animal tracks in fresh powder, how to stay oriented when everything looked the same. The deep snow made Samuel's work harder but also more profitable. Animals were moving more, desperate to find food before the worst of winter set in. His traps yielded consistently, and Samuel spent his evenings carefully preparing the pelts, scraping and stretching them while Caroline worked on her own tasks nearby. Sometimes she sang while she worked, old songs from her childhood, and Samuel would stop what he was doing just to listen to her voice. James and William adapted to mountain life with the resilience of children. They learned to split kindling and haul water from the creek Samuel kept clear of ice. They studied their letters with Caroline each morning and learned wilderness skills from Samuel each evening. William, the younger one, had a gift for spotting animal signs that impressed even Samuel. James was more cautious and thoughtful, but he had steady hands and the patience required for detailed work. "They are good boys," Samuel told Caroline one evening after the children had gone to bed. "You have done well with them, keeping them safe and raising them right." "We have done well with them," Caroline corrected. "Samuel, you have been as much a father to them as their own father was, perhaps more so. They adore you." "They are easy to love," Samuel said, "just like their aunt." Caroline blushed, even after months of marriage, even after all the intimate moments they had shared. "You still make me feel like a girl receiving her first compliment." "Good," Samuel said, pulling her into his lap despite her laughing protest. "You should always feel treasured, because you are." He kissed her deeply, his hands spanning her waist, and she melted against him with a sigh of contentment. They made love there by the fire, moving quietly and carefully so as not to wake the boys, and afterward Caroline stayed curled in Samuel's lap, both of them wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance. "I have something to tell you," Caroline said after a long, comfortable silence. Samuel's arms tightened around her slightly. "What is it?" "I think I am with child," Caroline said quietly. "I'm not certain yet, but my courses are late and I have been feeling strange in the mornings." Samuel's breath caught. "A baby?" "Yes," Caroline said. She twisted in his lap to see his face, anxious about his reaction. "I know we have not been married long, and this cabin is small, and money is tight. But Samuel, I want this. I want your child." "Caroline," Samuel said, and his voice was thick with emotion. He cupped her face in his big, rough hands and looked at her with wonder. "There is nothing in this world I want more than to have a child with you. We will make it work. I will build an addition to the cabin. I will trap more. I will do whatever it takes." Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "You are happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Samuel said. He kissed her fiercely. "You have given me everything, and now you are giving me more. I do not have words for what I feel right now." They held each other by the firelight, two people who had found each other against all odds, planning for a future that kept getting brighter. Winter deepened, and Samuel's routine never changed. Rise before dawn, set traps in the darkness, return to the cabin for breakfast with his family, head back out to check the traps late in the day, arrive home before full night fell. It was grueling work made more challenging by snow and ice and temperatures that could kill an unprepared man in hours. But Samuel never faltered, driven by love and responsibility and the bone-deep need to provide for his growing family. Caroline's pregnancy progressed, and Samuel watched the changes in her body with protective tenderness. He insisted she rest more and work less, taking over chores she normally handled. He taught the boys to help with cooking and cleaning so Caroline would not strain herself. He brought home extra meat and made sure she ate well, determined that both she and the baby would be healthy. "You are hovering," Caroline told him one afternoon in mid-January, but her tone was affectionate rather than annoyed. "I'm making sure you are safe," Samuel corrected. He was in the middle of reinforcing the cabin's roof, worried about the weight of accumulated snow. "Samuel, women have been having babies since the beginning of time," Caroline pointed out. "I am not made of glass." "You are precious," Samuel said firmly. He climbed down from the roof and came to stand in front of her, snow dusting his shoulders and hair. "You are carrying my child. I'm going to hover, and you are going to let me, because it makes me feel better." Caroline reached up and brushed snow from his beard, her touch gentle. "You are impossible and wonderful, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "That makes two of us," Samuel said. He kissed her there in the snow, this woman who had become his entire world. He kept his promise about always returning in time to hold her, even when weather made it dangerous. There was one terrible day in late January when a storm rolled in faster than Samuel had anticipated. He was checking his furthest trap line, 6 miles from the cabin, when the wind picked up and snow began falling so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. Samuel knew immediately that he was in trouble. The smart thing would be to find shelter, wait out the storm, return in the morning when visibility improved. But the thought of Carolyn waiting, worrying, not knowing if he was safe, drove him forward into the whiteout. He navigated by instinct and memory, following the shape of ridges he knew by heart, counting his steps, pausing every few minutes to get his bearings. The temperature dropped brutally, and ice formed in his beard. His fingers went numb even inside thick gloves. But Samuel pushed on, step after step, because Caroline was waiting and he had never broken his promise to her. He stumbled into the cabin 2 hours after full dark, half frozen and exhausted. Caroline cried out when she saw him, rushing to help him inside. She stripped off his frozen outer layers with shaking hands, while the boys brought blankets and stoked the fire higher. "You could have died," Caroline said, and there were tears streaming down her face. "Samuel, you could have died out there." "But I did not," Samuel said through chattering teeth. "I promised you I would always come back." "Not if it means killing yourself," Caroline said fiercely. She was rubbing his hands between hers, trying to bring warmth back to his fingers. "I need you alive, Samuel. We all need you alive. Please, promise me you will never take a risk like that again." Samuel looked at her tear-stained face, at the boys hovering anxiously nearby, at the swell of her belly where his child grew, and he nodded. "I promise. I'm sorry. I just needed to get back to you." "I know," Caroline whispered. She pressed her forehead to his. "I know, and I love you for it. But Samuel, I would rather spend one night worrying than spend the rest of my life without you. Do you understand?" "I understand," Samuel said. And he did, though it went against every protective instinct in his body to imagine leaving her wondering and waiting. They compromised that night, agreeing that in truly dangerous weather he would find shelter rather than push through, and that Caroline would trust him to make it home as soon as conditions allowed. February brought slightly warmer temperatures and longer daylight hours. Samuel used the improving conditions to start work on the cabin addition. He felled trees and hauled logs, working whenever he was not running his trap lines. The boys helped as much as they were able, and even Carolyn contributed despite Samuel's protests, helping to strip bark and prepare the wood. "This baby is coming in late summer," Samuel said as he worked. "I want to have this addition finished by then, with a proper bedroom for us and more space for the boys." "You are ambitious," Carolyn said, watching him lift a massive log that would have required 2 normal men to move. "I am motivated," Samuel corrected. He positioned the log and began notching it to fit with the others. "My family is growing. I need to grow our home to match." By the end of March, the addition was taking shape. Samuel had built a new bedroom extending from the back of the original cabin, with real windows he had purchased in Bannock using money from his winter's worth of pelts. He constructed a separate sleeping area for the boys, giving everyone more privacy. The work was exhausting on top of his daily trap routine, but Samuel thrived on it, driven by purpose and love. Caroline's belly grew round and prominent. She moved more slowly now, one hand often resting on the swell of the baby. Samuel found himself constantly watching her, marveling at the miracle of the life they had created. At night, he would place his hand on her stomach and feel the baby kick, strong movements that made him laugh with joy. "He is going to be big like his father," Caroline said one evening, as a particularly vigorous kick made her wince. "Or she's going to be strong like her mother," Samuel replied. He rubbed Caroline's back, trying to ease the ache he knew she felt. "Either way, this child is blessed." "The child is blessed to have you," Caroline said softly. "Not every man would take on a woman with 2 orphaned nephews and love them all like you do." "They are not burdens," Samuel said immediately. "You are not a burden. You are my family, and I would fight the world to keep you safe." April arrived with the rush of snowmelt and the return of green to the mountains. Samuel's trap lines became less productive as animals moved into their spring patterns, but that was expected. He had saved carefully all winter, and they had enough to last until the next season. He finished the cabin addition and moved their belongings into the new space. The boys were delighted with their own room, and Samuel took private pleasure in having a bedroom with a real door where he and Caroline could have privacy. Caroline's energy returned in her second trimester, and she spent long hours preparing for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric Samuel had purchased, knitted blankets and caps, organized supplies. Samuel built a cradle from smooth pine, carving simple designs into the wood. It was nothing fancy, but it was made with love and care, and Caroline cried when she saw it. "It is perfect," she said, running her fingers over the carved flowers. "Samuel, you made this with your own hands for our child. That makes it more precious than anything we could have bought." "I want to give you everything," Samuel said. He knelt beside her and placed his hand on her belly. "I want to give this baby everything." "You already are," Caroline assured him. "Love and safety and a home. What else could we need?" May brought warm sunshine and the explosive growth of spring. The meadows near the cabin burst into bloom with wildflowers, and Caroline walked among them in the evenings with Samuel, her hand in his, her other hand supporting her heavy belly. The boys ran ahead, chasing butterflies and exploring with the fearless enthusiasm of children who had learned the mountains were a playground rather than a threat. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked her one evening as they stood on the ridge overlooking their valley. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Caroline replied. She leaned against his side, fitting perfectly under his arm despite her expanded midsection. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if that wagon had not crashed. I would have reached the goldfields, lived in some rough mining camp, spent my days cooking for prospectors and trying to raise the boys in chaos and violence. Instead, you are stuck in the mountains with me," Samuel said. "Instead, I am blessed to build a life with the man I love," Caroline corrected. "Samuel, that accident brought me to exactly where I was meant to be. I believe that with my whole heart." Samuel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Then I suppose I owe thanks to fate or God or whatever force brought you to me." In mid-June, Caroline began teaching Samuel to read properly. He knew the basics, enough to get by, but she wanted him to be able to read to their children, to write letters if needed, to have all the skills that would serve them well. They spent evenings together with the poetry book she had saved, Samuel slowly working through the verses while Caroline helped with difficult words. It was intimate and sweet, this sharing of knowledge, and Samuel treasured these quiet moments as much as any other aspect of their marriage. "You are a good student," Caroline told him after he successfully read an entire poem without help. "Better than you give yourself credit for." "I am motivated," Samuel said, echoing his earlier words about the cabin. "I want to be able to teach our son or daughter properly." "You will be a wonderful father," Caroline said with absolute certainty. "You already are, to James and William. This baby could not ask for better." The baby came on a sweltering evening in late July, 3 weeks earlier than Caroline had calculated. Samuel had just returned from checking his traps when Caroline's face went tight with pain. She breathed through it, waiting until it passed before speaking calmly. "I think this is labor," she said. "The baby is coming." Samuel's heart kicked into his throat, but he forced himself to stay calm. They had prepared for this. He had ridden to Bannock a month ago to bring back a midwife named Mrs. Patterson, paying her to stay in town ready to come when needed. But looking at Caroline's face, at the way she was breathing, Samuel knew there was no time to fetch the midwife. This baby was coming now. "James, take William and go outside," Samuel said with forced calm. "Stay near the cabin, but give us privacy. Can you do that?" James nodded seriously, his young face showing understanding beyond his years. He gathered his brother and shepherded him outside. Samuel turned his full attention to Caroline. "I need you to trust me," Samuel said, taking her hands. "I have delivered foals and calves. The principle should be similar. I will take care of you." "I trust you completely," Caroline said. Then another contraction hit and she gasped, her hands crushing his. The next several hours were the most terrifying of Samuel's life. He had faced enemy soldiers, fought bears, survived blizzards that killed other men, but none of it compared to watching Caroline in the pain of childbirth and knowing her life and the baby's life depended on him. He boiled water and gathered clean cloths, helped Caroline move into positions that eased the labor, spoke encouragement even when his own heart was racing with fear. Caroline was incredibly strong. She bore the pain with gritted teeth and determination, following Samuel's instructions, working with her body rather than against it. When the baby finally came, sliding into Samuel's waiting hands, he was overwhelmed with relief and joy and terror at the tiny, fragile life he held. "Is the baby all right?" Caroline gasped, trying to sit up. "He is perfect," Samuel said, his voice breaking. because the baby was crying lustily, small fists waving, unmistakably alive and healthy. "Caroline, we have a son." He cleaned the baby with gentle hands, wrapped him in a soft blanket, and placed him in Caroline's arms. She looked down at their child with wonder, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "He has your eyes," she whispered. "Look, Samuel, he has your blue eyes." Samuel knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and his son, and felt emotion so intense it threatened to overwhelm him. "Thank you," he said roughly. "Thank you for him, for everything. Caroline, you are amazing." "We made him together," Caroline said softly. She reached out with one hand and touched Samuel's bearded cheek. "He is part of both of us, evidence of our love." They named him Thomas, after Caroline's brother who had died bringing her west. It felt right to honor the man whose death had inadvertently brought Samuel and Caroline together. Little Thomas was a healthy baby with a good set of lungs and his father's dark hair. James and William were enchanted with their new cousin, wanting to help with everything, and Samuel found himself presiding over a household that felt full and complete in ways he had never imagined. Caroline recovered quickly from the birth, though Samuel hovered protectively for weeks. He insisted she rest, taking over all the household work himself while also maintaining his trap lines. It was exhausting, but Samuel had never been afraid of hard work, and the reward of coming home each evening to his family made every tired muscle worthwhile. "You are going to wear yourself out," Caroline told him one evening in mid-August as he stumbled through the door after dark. "I am fine," Samuel said, though in truth he was bone-tired in a way he had not been since his first winter in Montana. "You are not fine," Caroline said firmly. She had Thomas in a sling against her chest, nursing while she moved around the cabin. "Samuel, you are trying to do everything yourself. Let me help. I am healed, I am strong, and I need to be useful again." "You are taking care of our son," Samuel protested. "I can do both," Caroline said. "Many women do. Please let me be your partner again, instead of someone you have to take care of." Samuel looked at her, at the determination in her honey-colored eyes, and nodded slowly. "You are right. I am sorry. I just want to make everything perfect for you." "It already is perfect," Caroline assured him. She came to him and kissed him softly, the baby between them making small, satisfied sounds. "Our life is perfect because we are living it together. Stop trying to do everything alone." So Samuel let her help again, and their household found a new rhythm. Caroline cooked and cleaned with Thomas strapped to her body, the baby sleeping or watching the world with wide blue eyes. James and William took on more responsibilities, hauling water and splitting wood and tending to the horse. Samuel continued his trap work but also involved the whole family in preparing the pelts, teaching everyone the proper techniques so the work went faster. Autumn arrived again, marking a full year since Samuel had found Caroline and the boys stumbling through the snow. The aspens turned gold, and the air took on the crisp edge of approaching winter. Samuel stood on his ridge one morning, looking down at the expanded cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, and felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything his life had become. He set his traps before dawn as always, working quickly in the pre-dawn darkness. He had added 3 new trap lines this year, expanding his territory to bring in more income for his growing family. The work was harder, but Samuel was motivated by love and purpose, by the knowledge that Caroline and the children depended on him. He checked his traps late as the sun was beginning its descent behind the western peaks. His catch was good, 3 beavers and a fox, pelts that would fetch decent money. Samuel worked efficiently, resetting the traps and cleaning the animals, always aware of the remaining daylight, always calculating how long it would take to reach home, because that was the one constant in his life that never changed. No matter how far he ranged or how hard he worked, Samuel always made it back before full dark. He always kept his promise to Caroline that he would return in time to hold her. He came through the cabin door just as the last light was fading from the sky. The interior was warm and bright with lamplight. Caroline was sitting by the fire nursing Thomas, her hair down around her shoulders, looking like something from a beautiful dream. James and William were at the table working on their lessons. The whole scene was so perfect, so exactly what Samuel had never known he wanted, that he had to pause and take it in. Caroline looked up and smiled, that same welcoming smile she had given him every evening for a year now. "You are home." I am home, Samuel agreed. He crossed the cabin and knelt beside her chair, wrapping one arm around her waist while his other hand gently touched Thomas's soft head. Always. Winter arrived early that year, but Samuel was prepared. The cabin was tight and warm, the woodpile enormous, the food stores more than adequate. His family was safe and healthy, and that was all that mattered. Samuel continued his routine through the snow and cold, rising before dawn, working hard all day, returning before dark to the woman and children who made everything worthwhile. Carolyn bloomed in her role as wife and mother. She had found her place in this wild country, had built skills and confidence that made her invaluable to their survival. She could skin a rabbit as efficiently as Samuel now, could identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, could read weather signs and manage the household with capable ease. But she still greeted Samuel each evening with that soft smile, still came into his arms each night with trust and love, still made him feel like the most fortunate man alive. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked her one night as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping in his cradle nearby. "Marrying me, staying here, giving up any chance at a different life?" "Never," Caroline said immediately. She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the darkness. "Samuel, this is the life I want. You are the man I want. I would choose this again every single day." "I just want you to be happy," Samuel said quietly. "I know this is hard, being so isolated, working so constantly just to survive." "I am happy," Caroline insisted. She took his rough hand and placed it over her heart so he could feel it beating. "Feel that? My heart is yours, completely and forever. There is nowhere else I want to be, nothing else I want to do. This life we have built together is more than I ever dreamed of having." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her deeply, pouring all his love into the gesture. They made love slowly in the darkness, reaffirming their bond, and afterward, Caroline fell asleep with her head on his chest, and Samuel lay awake counting his blessings. The years began to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Thomas grew from a baby into a toddler, taking his first steps on the cabin floor while Samuel and Caroline watched with pride. James and William shot up in height, becoming gangly boys who could trap and hunt alongside Samuel. The cabin expanded again as Samuel built additional rooms, creating more space for their growing family. Caroline became pregnant again when Thomas was 2 years old. This time, Samuel knew what to expect, though he was no less protective or attentive. Their daughter Elizabeth was born on a spring morning in 1879, delivered by the same midwife who had missed Thomas's birth but made it in time for this one. Elizabeth had Caroline's honey-colored eyes and a temperament that suggested she would be just as strong-willed as her mother. "2 children," Caroline said as she held Elizabeth, with Thomas sitting beside her on the bed, staring at his baby sister with fascination. "We are truly blessed. We could have a dozen more and I would thank God for each one," Samuel said. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, one arm around Caroline, his free hand touching Elizabeth's tiny fist. "Our family is the best thing I ever built. Life in the Montana mountains was never easy, but it was rich with love and purpose." Samuel continued his trap work, rising before dawn every single day, checking his lines late, always returning home in time to hold Caroline. It had become more than a promise. It was a fundamental part of who he was. The mountain man who set traps before dawn and checked late, but who was always back in time to hold his wife. The boys grew into young men who could handle rifles and traps as well as Samuel. James at 16 was quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for reading sign that surpassed even Samuel's considerable skill. William at 14 was more outgoing and adventurous, already talking about exploring further into the mountains, finding his own territory to trap. Samuel listened to their dreams and gave advice, proud of the men they were becoming. Thomas at 5 was a wild bundle of energy who followed Samuel everywhere, asking endless questions about animals and weather and how things worked. Elizabeth at 3 was her mother in miniature, sweet and determined in equal measure, already showing signs of the intelligence and strength that made Caroline such a remarkable woman. On a crisp autumn evening in 1881, Samuel stood on his ridge overlooking the valley as he had done countless times before. He was 33 years old now, his body bearing the marks of hard living, but still strong and capable. Below him, the cabin glowed with warm light, expanded into a proper home with multiple rooms and a good solid roof. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could see Caroline moving past the window. 5 years, Samuel thought with wonder. 5 years since he found her half frozen in the snow, and every single day had been a gift. He had given her his promise that first winter, had vowed silently to always return to her, to always be there when she needed him. And he had kept that promise without fail, through storms and injuries and exhaustion, through the daily grind of surviving in country that broke weaker people. Because Caroline was waiting, because their children needed him, because this family they had built together was worth any sacrifice, any hardship. Samuel made his way down the ridge as darkness gathered. He could see his breath in the cold air, could hear the first ice forming on the creek. Winter was coming again, his 7th winter with Caroline, and he was ready for it. Ready for the hard work and long dark nights, ready for everything, because he had his family waiting in the warm cabin. He pushed through the door and was immediately engulfed in noise and warmth. Thomas ran to him as always, wrapping himself around Samuel's legs. Elizabeth toddled over, demanding to be picked up. James and William called greetings from where they were cleaning their rifles. And Caroline turned from the hearth with that smile, that perfect, welcoming smile that made Samuel's heart race just like it had the very first time. "You are home," she said, and those words had become more than a greeting. They were an acknowledgement of his promise kept, of his love demonstrated through action day after day. "I am home," Samuel agreed. He gathered Elizabeth into his arms, kept one hand on Thomas's head, and crossed to Caroline. He kissed her softly, breathing in her familiar scent, feeling the solid reality of her presence. Always. That night, after dinner and stories and finally getting the younger children settled, Samuel and Caroline sat together by the fire. It had become their ritual, this quiet time at the end of each day when they could simply be together. Caroline leaned against Samuel's side, her head on his shoulder, and Samuel held her close with one arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Caroline asked softly. "I'm thinking about how different my life is from what I expected," Samuel admitted. "When I came to Montana, I thought I would always be alone. I thought that was what I deserved after the war, after everything I had seen and done." "And now?" Caroline prompted. "Now I cannot imagine being alone," Samuel said. He tightened his arm around her. "You changed everything, Caroline. You and the children gave me a reason to care about tomorrow, a reason to work hard and stay safe and build something that will last beyond my own life." Caroline turned her head to kiss his jaw. "You gave me the same things. You saved my life that day in the snow, but you did more than that. You gave me a home and a future, and love that I thought had died with my brother. You became everything to me." "I will always come back to you," Samuel said quietly. It was the promise he had made silently 5 years ago, the vow he had kept every single day since. "No matter what happens, no matter where I have to go or what I have to do, I will always be back in time to hold you." "I know," Caroline said simply. "You have proven it every day we have been together. That is who you are, Samuel, a man who keeps his promises." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying the promise of snow. But inside the cabin, all was warm and safe, a family secure in the knowledge of their love for each other. "Do you think we will have more children?" Caroline asked after a while. Samuel looked down at her, seeing the question in her eyes. "Do you want more?" "I think I might," Caroline admitted. "I love being a mother, and you are such a wonderful father. It seems greedy to want more when we are already so blessed, but I cannot help thinking our family could grow even larger." "Then we will have more children," Samuel said simply. "As many as you want, as many as God sees fit to give us. I will build more rooms onto this cabin. I will trap more territory. I will do whatever it takes to provide for all of them." Caroline smiled and kissed him properly, deeply, in a way that suggested they might start working on that additional child very soon. Samuel responded with enthusiasm, his body stirring despite the long, exhausting day he had put in. Caroline could always do this to him, could make him forget his tiredness and remember only desire. They moved to their bedroom, closing the door for privacy, and came together with the practiced ease of long familiarity mixed with the enduring passion of deep love. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, and Samuel felt the profound peace that came from being exactly where he was meant to be. The years continued to unfold with their steady rhythm. Samuel rose before dawn, set his traps in darkness, worked hard through the day, and returned before night fell to the family that was his entire world. Caroline managed their expanding household with grace and capability, raising their children to be strong and kind and capable. Their family grew as Caroline had hoped, adding another son named Henry in 1882 and twin daughters named Margaret and Mary in 1884. The cabin expanded into a sprawling structure that bore little resemblance to the simple one-room building Samuel had originally constructed. There were bedrooms for the children, a proper kitchen area, even a small room that served as a schoolroom where Caroline taught reading and writing and arithmetic. Samuel built a barn for their horse and the milk cow they had acquired, and a smokehouse for preserving meat. Their homestead was becoming prosperous through sheer hard work and careful management. James left home at 18 to establish his own trap lines in the mountains to the north, promising to visit regularly. Samuel was proud of the man his nephew had become, capable and honorable, ready to build his own life. William stayed closer, taking over some of Samuel's territory so the older man could reduce his range. At 20, he was already courting a girl from Bannock, talking about marriage and building his own cabin nearby. Samuel was 38 years old in the spring of 1886, still strong but feeling the accumulated wear of years spent in harsh conditions. His body ached more in cold weather, and injuries that would have healed quickly in his youth now took longer to mend. But he continued his routine without fail, rising before dawn, checking traps late, always returning home to Caroline. She was 34 now, still beautiful to Samuel's eyes despite the silver threads appearing in her honey-colored hair and the lines that had formed around her eyes and mouth. Those lines came from smiling and laughing, from years of joy and love, and Samuel treasured each one as evidence of their life together. She had borne him 5 children and helped raise her nephews, had turned his rough cabin into a real home, had been his partner in every way that mattered. "Are you happy?" Samuel asked her one evening as they sat on the porch they had built, watching their younger children play in the meadow. Thomas at 8 was teaching 7-year-old Henry to skip stones in the creek. The 3-year-old twins were picking wildflowers under Caroline's watchful eye. "I am happy beyond measure," Caroline said. She was knitting a sweater for Henry, her hands moving with practiced ease. "Samuel, I've spent the last 10 years living a life I never imagined possible. I have a husband who loves me, children who bring me joy, a home in one of the most beautiful places on earth. How could I be anything but happy?" "I just want to make sure," Samuel said. He was whittling a toy horse for the twins, shaving curls of wood that fell at his feet. "I know this life is hard, especially for a woman. You work from before dawn until after dark every day. You never get to wear fancy dresses or attend parties or have any of the things you might have had back east." Caroline set down her knitting and reached over to take his hand, stilling the knife. "Samuel Bridger, you listen to me. I do not want fancy dresses or parties. I do not want anything except exactly what I have right now. You have given me a life of purpose and meaning. You have loved me and cherished me and built a family with me. That is worth more than all the silk gowns and fancy parties that ever existed." Samuel lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles, his beard soft against her skin. "I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I did not think that was possible." "Love grows," Caroline said softly. "It gets deeper and stronger with every shared experience, every challenge overcome together, every quiet moment like this one. We have built something extraordinary, Samuel. Our love is the foundation of everything good in our lives." That night, after the children were finally settled and the cabin was quiet, Samuel and Caroline made love with the slow intensity of a couple who knew each other completely. There was no urgency, no desperation, just the deep pleasure of connection and intimacy. Afterward, Caroline curled against Samuel's side as she had done for 10 years now, and he held her close, breathing in her scent, feeling her heartbeat against his ribs. "Promise me something," Caroline whispered in the darkness. "Anything," Samuel replied immediately. Promise me that as we get older, as the work becomes harder, you will let the boys take over more of the trapping, Caroline said. Promise me you will not work yourself to death trying to provide for us. We have enough, Samuel. We have more than enough. I need you alive and healthy more than I need any amount of money or pelts. Samuel was quiet for a moment, thinking about his daily routine, about how much of his identity had become wrapped up in being the man who rose before dawn and always came home to hold his wife. I promise I will be careful, he finally said. I promise I will let William and Thomas take on more of the work as they get old enough. But Caroline, I also need you to understand that going out to those trap lines, working hard all day, and then coming home to you is what makes me who I am. It is how I show my love, through providing and protecting. I know, Caroline said gently. She reached up and touched his bearded face in the darkness. I know, and I love you for it. I just want you to be here with me for as long as possible. I want to grow old with you, Samuel. I want decades more of you coming through that door at the end of each day. Then that is what you will have, Samuel promised. I will be here, always, for as long as God allows. The promise became even more important as the years passed and Samuel's body began showing the accumulated strain of a lifetime of hard labor. He was 41 when he fell on ice and broke his arm badly enough that it took 3 months to heal properly. Caroline nursed him through it with patient care, and William and Thomas took over the trap lines without complaint. Samuel chafed at the inactivity, but also discovered something valuable during those 3 months. He could still contribute to his family's well-being without physically working himself into exhaustion every day. He taught the younger children more advanced skills, passing on everything he knew about surviving in the mountains. He repaired and maintained equipment, built new traps, prepared pelts with meticulous care. He spent more time with Caroline, talking and laughing and remembering all the years they had shared. And when his arm finally healed and he returned to his trap lines, he did so with a new understanding of balance. He still rose before dawn, but now Thomas often rose with him and they worked together setting the traps. He still checked late, but William frequently accompanied him, learning the best locations and techniques. Samuel was training the next generation, ensuring that his family's livelihood would continue even after he was too old to do the physical work himself. And every evening, without fail, Samuel returned home before full dark and took Caroline in his arms. That ritual never changed, never diminished in importance. It was the cornerstone of their relationship, the physical manifestation of his promise to always be there for her. The Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, and Samuel and Caroline celebrated by hosting a gathering for all the families in their part of the mountains. James came down from his trap lines with his new wife, a capable mountain woman named Sarah. William brought his wife Anna and their baby daughter. Friends and neighbors Samuel had known for years arrived to share food and conversation. The cabin was bursting with people and noise and laughter, and Samuel stood on his porch watching it all with deep satisfaction. We have built something good here, Caroline said, coming to stand beside him. She slipped her hand into his and leaned against his arm. Look at all these people, all these connections and relationships. You did this, Samuel. You created a place where family and community could thrive. We did this together, Samuel corrected. I might have built the cabin, but you made it a home. You turned my isolated existence into something rich and meaningful. They stood together, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, surrounded by the evidence of their life's work. Children ran shrieking with laughter through the meadow. Men discussed trap lines and weather patterns. Women shared recipes and stories. It was chaotic and loud and absolutely perfect. As the last guests departed and Samuel helped Caroline clean up the debris of the gathering, she suddenly stopped and looked at him seriously. I want you to know something. What is it? Samuel asked, concerned by her tone. I want you to know that these past 13 years have been the happiest of my life, Caroline said. Every single day with you has been a gift, and no matter what happens in the future, no matter how many years we have left together, I will always be grateful that wagon crashed and brought me to you. Samuel crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. I love you, he said simply, because sometimes the most important things could be expressed in the simplest words. I will always love you. And I will always love you, Carolyn replied against his chest. My mountain man who sets traps before dawn and checks late, but who is always back in time to hold me. The years that followed were gentler than the early ones, though no less rich with meaning. Samuel was 44 when Thomas took over primary responsibility for the trap lines, with Henry beginning to learn the trade at age 13. Samuel still worked, but his role shifted more toward supervision and teaching, allowing him to preserve his strength for the long haul. He found satisfaction in this new phase of life, pride in watching his sons carry on the work he had begun. Caroline's hands showed arthritis starting in her late 30s, making fine work difficult, but she adapted by teaching the twin daughters to take over sewing and detailed tasks. Margaret and Mary, at 8 years old, were already capable helpers, learning everything their mother could teach about managing a mountain household. Elizabeth, at 13, was turning into a beautiful young woman who had inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's strength. Samuel was 48 years old on a spring morning in 1896 when he rose before dawn, as he had done for over 20 years. His joints ached more than they used to, and his hair and beard were more gray than dark now. But the routine was so ingrained in his bones that he could not imagine any other way to start the day. He kissed Caroline's sleeping forehead, pulled on his clothes quietly so as not to wake her, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas was waiting by the barn, already geared up for the day's work. At 18, he was as tall as Samuel and nearly as broad through the shoulders, a young man in his prime. "Morning, Pa," he said quietly. "Morning, son," Samuel replied. They worked together in comfortable silence, checking gear and preparing for the trek to the trap lines. This partnership with his son had become one of Samuel's greatest joys, this passing on of knowledge and tradition. They set traps as the sun rose, working quickly and efficiently. Samuel let Thomas take the lead now, only occasionally offering suggestions or corrections. The boy had learned well, had instincts that sometimes surpassed Samuel's own. By the time they finished, Samuel was feeling the strain of the work more than he liked to admit, but he would never let on. Some things a man did not admit, even to himself. They returned to the cabin for breakfast, and Caroline had food waiting as she always did. The whole family gathered around the expanded table Samuel had built years ago, passing plates and talking about the day's plans. Henry was heading out to check his own trap line, still supervised, but increasingly independent. Elizabeth was going to help Caroline with the extensive garden they maintained. The twins had lessons to complete, and then were responsible for tending the chickens and gathering eggs. It was an ordinary morning, exactly like thousands of others Samuel had experienced. And as he looked around the table at his family, at Caroline smiling as she served food, at his children healthy and happy and capable, Samuel felt the same profound gratitude he had felt every day since finding this woman in the snow. After breakfast, Samuel and Thomas headed back out to check the traps from the previous day. This was Samuel's favorite part of the routine, the moment when he would see what the night had brought, when his hard work translated into tangible results. They had good catches, pelts that would fetch decent prices. Samuel worked alongside Thomas, skinning and cleaning the animals, teaching by example the careful techniques that preserved quality. The sun was starting its descent when they finally finished and began the trek back to the cabin. Samuel was tired, the good kind of tired that came from honest work well done. He calculated the remaining daylight automatically, measuring it against the distance home, knowing as he always knew that he would make it back before full dark. They crested the final ridge, and the cabin came into view. Smoke rose from the chimney. Golden lamplight glowed in the windows as evening approached, and Samuel knew with absolute certainty that Caroline would be watching for him, waiting for his return as she had waited every evening for 20 years. "You think Ma worries?" Thomas asked suddenly, as if reading Samuel's mind. "Even after all these years, you think she still worries when we are out here?" "I think she trusts us to be careful," Samuel said slowly, "but I think she probably breathes easier when we walk through that door at the end of the day. Your mother has lost too many people she loved. I promised her a long time ago that I would always come back to her, and I have done everything in my power to keep that promise." "That's a good way to love someone," Thomas said thoughtfully, "proving it through actions every single day instead of just saying words." "Words are important too," Samuel said, "but yes, actions matter. Remember that when you find a woman you want to marry, Show her your love in everything you do." They reached the cabin just as the last sunlight faded from the western peaks. Samuel pushed through the door and was immediately wrapped in warmth and the smell of dinner cooking. Caroline turned from the hearth with that smile, that perfect, welcoming smile that still made his heart race after 20 years. "You are home," she said, and the relief in her voice was audible even after thousands of repetitions of this moment. "I am home," Samuel confirmed. He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms, holding her close despite his dirty clothes and the smell of his work. "Always." Caroline wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest. "Always," she echoed. That night, after dinner was finished and the children were settled, Samuel and Carolyn sat together on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Carolyn was knitting something soft and small, and Samuel realized with a start that it looked like baby clothes. "Are we expecting grandchildren?" he asked with amusement. "James's wife Sarah is expecting in the fall," Caroline confirmed. "I thought I would start preparing things to send up to them." "Our first grandchild," Samuel said wonderingly. "We are getting old, Caroline." "We are getting blessed," Carolyn corrected. She set down her knitting and took his hand, threading their fingers together. "We have lived a good life, Samuel. We have raised wonderful children, built a strong family, created something that will last long after we are gone. Not everyone can say that." "I could not have done any of it without you," Samuel said seriously. "You were the piece I did not know I was missing. Everything good in my life started the day I found you in the snow." "And everything good in my life started the moment you chose not to walk past someone in need," Caroline replied. "You saved me, Samuel, and then you loved me, and then you built this incredible life with me. I will never stop being grateful for any of it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands, watching the night sky. Samuel thought about all the dawns he had risen before, all the trap lines he had checked, all the evenings he had returned home. Thousands of repetitions of the same pattern, and yet each one had been important, each one had been a promise kept. I am slowing down," Samuel admitted quietly. "My body does not work like it used to. I cannot cover as much ground or work as many hours." "I know," Carolyn said gently. "And that is all right. You have trained our sons to carry on the work. You do not have to prove anything anymore, Samuel. You can let yourself rest." "But I still need to come home to you every evening," Samuel said firmly. "Even if I am not working the trap lines directly, even if I am just supervising or teaching, I still need that moment at the end of the day when I walk through the door and you turn to greet me." "And I will be there every evening, waiting," Caroline promised. "For as long as God gives us together, I will be waiting for you to come home." Samuel lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles. "Then I am the most fortunate man who ever lived." The seasons continued their endless cycle. Samuel turned 50, then 55, then 60. His body grew more stooped with age, his movements slower, his endurance less than it had been in his youth. But he still rose before dawn most mornings, still checked on his son's trap lines, even if he did not work them himself, still returned home each evening to Caroline's welcoming arms. Caroline aged alongside him, her honey-colored hair turning silver, her face lined with the evidence of decades spent laughing and loving and living fully. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis but still capable, still creating warmth and comfort for their family. She moved more slowly but with undiminished purpose, the matriarch of a large and growing family. Their children married and had children of their own, establishing homes scattered through the mountains within visiting distance of the original cabin. Samuel and Caroline became grandparents many times over, teaching a new generation the skills and values that had allowed them to thrive in this harsh, beautiful country. The original cabin expanded yet again to accommodate family gatherings, becoming a sprawling complex of rooms and porches where their descendants could gather. On a cold winter evening in 1906, Samuel sat by the fire with Caroline beside him, as they had done for 30 years now. He was 58 years old, she was 54, and they had been married for 3 decades. Samuel's body ached with a lifetime of hard labor, but his heart was full as he looked at the woman beside him. "Do you remember that first winter?" Samuel asked quietly. "When you and the boys were trapped here by the storm, and I did not know if you would stay or go once the weather cleared?" "I remember," Caroline said softly. "I remember being terrified that you would send us away, that we would have to leave this safe place and brave the world alone again." "I knew I loved you even then," Samuel admitted. "I tried to hide it, tried to give you space to grieve and heal. But from that very first night, I knew I wanted you to stay forever." "And I have stayed forever," Caroline said. She reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "You gave me a home, Samuel. Not just a physical place, though this cabin certainly became that. You gave me a place to belong, a purpose, a reason to keep living after I thought I had lost everything." "You gave me the same," Samuel replied. His voice was rough with emotion even after all these years. "I was so alone before you came. I did not realize how alone until I suddenly was not anymore." They sat together in the firelight, two people who had built an extraordinary life from the ashes of loss and loneliness. Outside, the wind howled and snow fell, but inside, all was warm and safe and full of love. "I want you to know something," Samuel said after a long, comfortable silence. "I want you to know that every single morning when I rose before dawn to set those traps, and every single evening when I rushed back to be here before dark, it was because of you. You were the reason for all of it. The trap lines, the hard work, the determination to provide and protect, all of it was for you." "I know," Caroline whispered. Tears were streaming down her lined face. "I have always known. And Samuel, I want you to know that every single evening when you walked through that door, my heart lifted with relief and joy. For 30 years, that moment has been the best part of my day. You kept your promise. You always came back to hold me." Samuel pulled Caroline into his arms, and she came willingly despite their aging bodies and limited flexibility. They held each other by the fire, two people who had found love in the wilderness and built something eternal from it. "Whatever time we have left," Samuel said quietly, "I will spend it loving you." "And I will spend it loving you," Caroline replied. The years that remained to them were precious beyond measure. Samuel no longer worked the trap lines at all, leaving that to his sons and grandsons. But he still rose before dawn most mornings out of habit, and he still made sure to be back at the cabin before dark each evening. The pattern was too deeply ingrained to break, the promise too important to abandon. Caroline's health began to decline when she was 63, her heart growing weak after a lifetime of hard labor and bearing multiple children. Samuel devoted himself to her care, with the same determination he had once devoted to trapping, making sure she was comfortable and pain-free, sitting with her for long hours, holding her hand, and reminiscing about their life together. On a warm spring evening in 1915, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, Caroline Fletcher Bridger passed away peacefully in the bed Samuel had built for her 39 years earlier. Samuel held her hand as she took her last breath, his tears falling freely, his heart breaking even as he understood that she had lived a full and beautiful life. He buried her on the ridge overlooking their valley, in a spot where she could see the cabin and the mountains she had loved. The entire family gathered for the funeral, and Samuel stood by her grave with tears streaming into his white beard, saying a final goodbye to the woman who had been his whole world. Life continued after Caroline's death, because that was what life did. But Samuel was forever changed by her absence. The cabin felt empty despite being frequently filled with children and grandchildren. Food lost its taste. Even the mountains seemed less vibrant without her there to share them. But Samuel kept his promise even after Caroline was gone. Every evening at dusk he would stand on the ridge by her grave, and he would speak to her as if she could hear him. He would tell her about his day, about the family, about all the small details of life. And then he would say what he had said every evening for 39 years. "I am home." Samuel lived for 3 more years after Caroline's death, years spent passing on final lessons to his descendants and putting his affairs in order. He made sure every child and grandchild knew the story of how he and Caroline had found each other, how their love had grown, how they had built something lasting through hard work and dedication and unwavering commitment to each other. On a cold winter morning in January 1918, Samuel rose before dawn for the last time. He was 70 years old, and his body was worn out from 7 decades of hard living. He dressed carefully in his warmest clothes and walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. His sons found him later that morning sitting beside Caroline's grave, having passed away peacefully looking out over the valley they had claimed as their own. The family buried Samuel next to Caroline on the ridge, marking both graves with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. The cabin and trap lines passed to Thomas and his children, but the story of Samuel and Caroline lived on through generations, passed down as an example of what true love looked like when combined with hard work and dedication. Decades later, when the cabin had been expanded and modernized but still stood in the same valley, when Montana had changed beyond recognition but the mountains remained eternal, Samuel and Caroline's great-great-grandchildren would stand on that ridge by those weathered gravestones and hear the story of the mountain man who set traps before dawn and checked late, but who was always back in time to hold his wife. They would hear about the woman who had come west seeking family and had found a love that lasted beyond death, and they would understand that the land beneath their feet, the family surrounding them, and the values they held dear were all built on the foundation of that extraordinary love. The graves stood side by side overlooking the valley, two people together in death as they had been in life, watching over the family and home they had created through 3 decades of dawn risings and evening returns, of promises kept and love demonstrated through action every single day. The mountain winds whispered through the pines around their resting place, carrying echoes of all the times Samuel had said, "I am home," and Carolyn had replied, "You are home," a conversation that had shaped 2 lives and countless others that followed. And on certain quiet evenings when the light was just right, if you stood on that ridge and listened carefully, you could almost hear the sound of a cabin door opening, the soft voice of a woman saying, "You are home," and the rough, gentle reply, "Always."